something happened to my wife this past week that was just interesting to me, and it reminded me of something I've been reading recently that I am quite confident there are probably a lot of people in this room that know this subject a lot better than I do. I actually wish we talked about it more, but it's communism. And I know it's probably not appropriate to talk about communism during Bible studies, but I think it's okay to talk about it a little bit where it touches faith, because it touches faith in a couple different ways. It touches our Christian faith in a couple different ways. The interesting thing, though, that I've been reading, because, boy, I remember very little of this, so I went back and brushed up on Karl Marx and some of his writings. And one of the things that's just really interesting to me is understanding Karl Marx and some of his writings helps me understand what's happening in the news a lot more, especially with some of the protests that are going on our university campuses. And it causes me to question, sometimes they say that Marxism is one of the things that's being taught. I'm wondering if it's not the major thing being taught on some university campuses because of what I see. And here's my example. Karl Marx wrote specifically that the goal of Marxism is total revolution. And he was very much against setting any goals along the way or any marks that you have made progress towards your goal, because he was afraid the proletariat, the classes, the masses would be too content if they saw themselves making progress, right? And so if you don't set any standards, you don't have any clear idea of what you're doing, he thinks that's a good thing, because you haven't really accomplished what he wants you to accomplish until you totally overthrow the government. And this is taking me way too long. But the ideal is everybody living totally equal, as far as the guy pushing the broom versus the guy working the computer versus the guy over the entire plant. They're all making 25 bucks an hour. Everybody's making the same thing. It's totally equal, and we're all driven not by incentives financially. We're driven by our noble spirit, because I can't say because I don't know how he feels on that. Anyway, boy, am I way off track. Don't set any goals. Don't set any goals. That's one of the reasons where when they interview protesters and they put a microphone in their face and they ask them the question about why are you out here? What do you want to accomplish? Have you noticed, like I have noticed, that a lot of people are like, I don't know, it's just bad. It's like there's no content to this. Well, what do you want? What if this happened or that happened? Would you be no, because the goal is total overthrow. And the reason I'm kind of getting this out there is because I do think this plays into what we're talking about tonight. John is writing this gospel so we know what it is to believe. God, throughout Scripture, I always think of Isaiah, the first chapter, come, let us reason together. God wants us to think things through, and he wants us to understand. That's why he's revealed himself to us. And the Gospel of John really spells things out, I think, clearly, because not only is he using signs, he's also using teaching, and he's also using examples. And I think one of the classic examples that is being focused on here towards the end would be Jesus' relationship with the 11 in particular. And John's never let go of his goal. His goal is to tell us, what does it mean to believe in Jesus Christ, Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, and believing have life in his name. Well, what does that mean? The 11 are a classic example of this. I mean, we've gone in the first 12 chapters of the Gospel of John, we've looked at the public ministry. But from chapter 13 on, we're just really focused on the 11. And even the 11 say they get it, say they believe. And we're going to see the example of Peter in particular. Wow, he doesn't know what he thinks he knows. Okay, let me go ahead and mention what happened to my wife. My wife went to a seminar last Saturday, and at this seminar, well, no, it was an earlier seminar. Anyway, one of the presenters said, we don't want to talk faith-based. We want to talk evidence-based. He presented faith-based versus Evidence-based. Okay, this is called linguistic theft because faith-based never meant it's an alternative to evidence-based. You know what faith-based means? Faith-based programs that the government set up were programs that under George Bush, am I the only one who was alive when Bush was president? Sorry. George, but it was before this, but he made this quite popular as far as programs, social programs, or community programs. Instead of the government doing it, if there's a Christian organization that could get involved in this or some other religious organization, he called it faith-based programs so that the government wouldn't have to be so involved in a lot of things. And that's where the term started, and now it's being used, faith-based versus evidence-based. Okay, I'm obviously wound up about stuff that I don't need to be wound up about. So let's just, I think the reason I say this, faith-based that we're talking about, belief-based, is evidence-based. It's not, okay, we don't have any evidence, so let's just go ahead and believe it anyway. No! That's why we have these signs. That's why Jesus constantly said, look at what I do and listen to what I say. The two great signs, Deuteronomy chapter 13, Deuteronomy chapter 18. How do you know if somebody's really from God? How do you know that it's not a false prophet? How do you know it's not somebody trying to trick you, con you? Two major things. Everything they do, it has to be 100% accurate. They have to be able to do what they say they're going to do. Jesus, in John chapter 5, verse 36, in John chapter 10, verses 37, 38, he says, if you have problems believing, you don't believe in me. Look at the things I do. Look at the miracles. Believe in them. Okay, so evidence of what he did, but it's not just evidence of what he did. You have to compare it to what he said. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, it says if some prophet comes along and does some great sign, but he says, let's follow other gods. You know, this guy is not from God, right? So it has to be not just what he does, has to be consistent with what he says. All the way through the Gospel of John, Jesus has been saying that. You know I'm from God. How do you know I'm from God? What I do and what I say. What I do and what I say. Keeps coming back to those, and some people are getting it. The people who don't get it, I think John's been making the case, it's not because there's not enough evidence, it's because they don't want to. Especially the religious leaders. Religious leaders, we're finding out it's a power play. Remember, Caiaphas said, don't you guys, talking to the other guys on the Supreme Court, don't you guys get it? It's better that this one guy dies than we lose the whole nation. Meaning, yeah, I know we're doing something really bad here. We're going to kill an innocent guy. Let's go and do it anyway. That's what he meant, right? Okay. Didn't want to. I think, though, there's a parallel to that today. Maybe it's not a power struggle, but a lot of times people don't want Christianity to be true. Maybe a good example of that would, and the first one comes to my mind is Mark chapter 5, where Jesus comes to the area of the Gadarenes, and remember the story with the demons cast into the 2,000 pigs that run down into the water, and when the guys who were watching the pigs went back into town and told them what happened, and everybody came out, and they see this guy who used to scare everybody to death in his right mind, and they also heard the news that the pigs are gone. Obviously, whoa, right? Impressive miracle. And what do they say to Jesus? Please leave. Would you please leave? Yeah, we were talking before class began. People in Jesus' family being presented with, wow, some powerful evidence. How can you not believe? Well, you can. It's easy not to believe if you don't want to believe. Chapter 18. Yes. Chapter 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, chapter 17, we have, remember, it's Jesus' prayer. Remember the three major divisions of the 17th chapter, Jesus, first 5 verses, his relationship with the Father. Then verse 6 down through 19, he prays for the 11. And then verse 20 to the end, he prays for everybody who believes in him through. There. Thank you. Thank you for filling in the blank. That's right. It's not just everybody who wants to be a Jesus person. It's people who follow the word. Believe in him through their message, the message of the apostles and prophets written down for us, protected by the Holy Spirit, or Bible. Bible. We'll just go with shorthand there. Okay, after that prayer, it says, when he had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden. What's the name of this garden?
Gethsemane.
Yeah, Gethsemane just means oil-pressed garden, in which he entered with his disciples. Okay, this first verse, if you've got your Bibles, and I don't, well, yeah, I do. If you've got your Bibles and you can flip back, look at the end of the 14th chapter. At the end of the 14th chapter, the very last line of the 14th chapter, what does it say? Very last line.
Let's go from here.
Yeah, come, let us leave. Okay. The beginning of the 15th chapter, do you have a heading over the 15th chapter?
The vine and the branches.
Vine and the branches. Jesus' classic teaching on the vine and the branches. Do you remember what we suggested? A lot of commentators suggest this. He said at the end of the 14th chapter, let's go. Where had they been in the 13th and 14th chapter? In the upper room. So at the end of his meal with them in the upper room, come, let us go. If he's leaving the upper room and walking past the temple courtyard area, one of the big impressive things you would see is this huge vine. Okay, makes a lot of sense. He says at the end of the 14th chapter, let's go. In the 15th chapter, there's the big vine, and he's teaching on the vine and the branches, right? I want to say that because either he left then, and all that we have in chapter 15, 16, 17, his prayer is taking place as they walk, or some people will say, you know, you've had this happen, haven't you? Haven't you? You've been visiting with somebody and you stand up and say, well, it's time to go. And then an hour later, you're still standing there talking to him and stuff. So just because he said, come let us leave, doesn't mean he left the room yet. And the reason we're a little fuzzy on exactly when he left the room, which I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. Sometime he left the room and he made it across the Kidron Valley and up to the Mount of Olives. But it's this verse compared with the last verse of the 14th chapter. Come let us go versus here. When he had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, and they go up. So he's leaving and he's going across, but they're talking as they go, which was a typical practice with rabbis, with teachers. They would talk as they go along, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of commentators think they're walking past and see the vine, because probably Jesus, a lot of his parables, like in the Matthew the 13th chapter, of the seed being scattered and things like that, maybe not, but probably as you're walking along, you see it, right? You see somebody casting seed, or you see some of these other things, and Jesus uses that as an opportunity, a visual aid. Let me tell you a story about the kingdom of God. It's like casting out seed. So anyway, so they go, they're headed to the garden. Now, in verse 2, it says, now Judas, also who was betraying him, we talked about this a lot, so I'm going to get sidetracked again. I don't want to. The word that's translated betray literally means, what does it mean to betray somebody? It literally means to hand over. Hand over. The reason that this always kind of gets me, I forget when this was first pointed out to me several years ago, but every time I see this, it just bothers me, because it's the same word in the Greek language, but sometimes they translate it hand over. And other times they translate it betray. Well, when you think about it, betraying somebody is handing them over to somebody else, right? But when it said that the Jewish leaders handed Jesus over to Pilate to be crucified, it's the same word. So you could translate that, he betrayed him. That makes sense, right? To hand over, because they betrayed him. Okay, they betrayed him, but that same word is also used when it talks about God handed his son over. It's in Romans the 8th chapter. You could translate that, he betrayed him. There's also a passage, well, we're going to see it a bunch tonight, where there's evidence that Jesus is in total control, hands himself over So he betrays himself. Anyway, just a very significant word, but we often associate it with Judas. Judas, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. This is one of the routines that we see demonstrated or evidence of many places in the gospel. Jesus made a habit of, even with his disciples, going to guard for prayer. And Jesus also made a habit of withdrawing even from his disciples so he could have time for prayer. And Jesus was busy from sunup till sundown. You talk about a busy schedule, but he always did. Sometimes he'd spend the whole night in prayer. If you like to listen to these sorts of things, there's a church called New Hope Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, where my brother preaches. But they've got old sermon series there, and they did a series of sermons called The Longest Night in the Bible. And it's on the night that Jesus prayed. And it's just really motivating to think about the priority that Jesus gave to prayer and always thinking about the will of the Father and everything he did. And anyway, the disciples, this was regular. This is something that Judas knew about because it being part of the disciples, he knew that it was common practice for Jesus to take the disciples there. Judas then, in verse 3, it says, having received the Roman cohort. Do you have a different word for cohort or a footnote there?
It says detachment of soldiers.
It says what?
Detachment of soldiers.
Band or, okay. The term cohort literally means, yes, what does yours say? Okay, the Praetorian, which verse are you in, Roger?
Was it 5?
Verse 3.
Oh, 3, okay. I was in 5. Okay.
Praetorian, yeah. Verse 3 is cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees came with lanterns and torches and weapons. This term cohort here, the way the Romans use this, and this is the Romans, these 600 men. The fact that it's 600 men causes a lot of people to say, well, maybe it could mean something else, because they have a hard time wrapping their mind around why in the world would you bring 600 men to go capture one man? Well, okay, I'm glad for the response. Did they send out guards before to try to get Jesus?
Yep.
How successful was that?
Zillow.
I think they're hysterical. I think they're panicking because, remember they said the whole world's going after him. They feel the power leaving them. I think they put pressure on the Romans, and I think it makes perfect sense. It may refer to another number, but to take it in its natural sense, 600 men coming out in the garden to get Jesus, I think it's a pretty impressive sight. They're the ones who have all the torches and lanterns and weapons with them. So Jesus knowing all, I did have one other note here, because John doesn't focus on this the way the other Gospels do, but over in Matthew chapter 26, verse 50, when Judas comes to betray him with the kiss, do you remember what Jesus says to Judas? My guess is maybe you don't remember the specifics, and there's a reason for that, because most translations translate it differently. And I went back and checked this out, and it's because they say it's extremely ambiguous the way it's written. So Jesus definitely said something to Judas, but exactly what he said, it's really hard to nail this down. And one of the things that's really hard to nail down is, did he say a statement or ask a question? But if you take it as a question, I just want to throw this on the table. Because verse 50, when he comes to Matthew 26, verse 50, Jesus replied to him when he kisses him with this greeting, Rabbi, Jesus replied, do what you came for, my friend. But if you take this as a question, which, by the way, that's the natural way to take it in the Greek, as a question. Then Jesus is saying, friend, what are you doing here? to me, that fits with Jesus' relationship with Judas, because he's not saying, Judas, you got to do this, or hurry up and do this. He is saying, Judas, are you sure you want to do this? Even to the very end, he's asking him that question, and he's trying to get Judas to think through what he's doing. Anyway, John doesn't spend as much time focusing on that aspect, but it's at this point in time that this happens. John is the last gospel written, so he knows that everybody's already got that part of the story. So Jesus, it says, they came with all these weapons, and in verse 4, it says, Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, who do you seek? That phrase where it says he knows everything's coming. Back in the 17th chapter, the very first verse, it says he knows his hour has come. Back in the 13th chapter, he makes a real point at the very beginning, like around verse 3 or so, before he washes the disciples' feet, before he gets up to the table, it makes this statement. He says, knowing that he's come from the Father and that he will soon be returning to the Father, he got up from the table and he I like this, and to me, this all ties together because Jesus spent so much time in prayer. It was a regular habit of his just to pray all the time. How does this all tie in? Because Jesus never lost the big picture. He always knew what he was here for. And you know what? Who cares if it's demeaning to wash somebody else's feet? That never bothered Jesus because he always remembered what he was here for. And so when it's time to face what's coming with the trial and the crucifixion, Jesus knew what he was here. To me, this is very motivating because sometimes it's so easy to get upset with that guy doesn't know how to drive and how to even park his car, and stuff like that is coming. Who cares, in the big picture? Don't lose the big picture. The more you focus on why we're here and what's really important, and there's eternity, and anymore, I've got a long way to go, and I know that, but anymore, when I goof up in traffic, I think to myself, oh, I hope this doesn't ruin a chance for me, because if he thinks a Christian cut him off in traffic, then I've really done something bad here. So at least I'm a little bit beyond traffic. Anyway, this Jesus knowing, I think this puts us in context. He always had the big picture. So knowing that, what does he do? He says, who do you see? Whom do you see? Verse 5, they answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. He said, okay, my translation says, he said, I am he. Is anybody else reading out of the New American Standard? Okay, what is the word he? It's italicized. What does that tell you in the New American Standard?
Yeah.
It's not there. It's not there. They put it in there. In other words, the Greek says, Jesus said, I am. Yes. And what does that mean? How many times has Jesus said that? Before Abraham was, I am. Yeah. Ego I me, which by the way is a way of saying I am. But this is the way in the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, when they translated God's name. Exodus chapter 3, Moses said, when they asked me what your name is, what should I tell them? And God says, tell them ego I me. The Greek I am. Use that exact same phrase. Does anybody else ever use that phrase? Yes, it can be used in other places. But this is the way the Greek translates God's name. And Jesus frequently uses it in a context where it's like, he's not just saying I am, he's saying I am. He's saying he's equal with God, yeah. And here, they say the Nazarene, and he says, I am. Anyway, Jesus said I am. And Judas also, who was betraying him, standing there with him. So when he said I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. They didn't just draw back. They collapsed. I think it's a domino thing myself. They fall down. Okay. The cohort, how many people?
600.
600 with what? Lanterns, torches, weapons. Here's loaded for bear. They're all out there. And Jesus stands out because we're going to see in a minute. He's protecting the 11. Part of what he's doing is protecting the 11. But he stands out. Who are you looking for? The Nazarene. I am. And it's like, they all fall down. Okay. I love this. It's majestic. I'm glad you're laughing. I just love this picture, right? Note here, majestic presence. So many times Jesus did things. How can you explain it? How could the guys, they're trying to push him off the cliff, and he just walks away? How does that happen? How is it they can't grab him? Majestic presence. There's just too many times where that's the only way you can explain it. Jesus is in total control. And I think that's one of the things that's being illustrated here. Jesus is going to go to the cross, and all this is going to happen because Jesus decided, I'm going to do it. Because they couldn't take him in. I mean, if, with one word, you can make all the army fall.
Yeah.
With 2 words, you could walk away. Right? Well, with the 1 word, you could. You wouldn't have to have any of that. Yeah.
Well, there's another story. Was it Elijah? I'm trying to remember when they came for him, and fire came in. And it finally came to the last group. Finally came up and said,
And God told him,
Yeah.
go down and talk to the
"Yeah,
the captain and his 50, the first 2. Yeah,
we know what God can do."
yeah, that's very true. That's very true. But I just find it so interesting. I am is what he says. They fall to the ground. Therefore, in verse 7 it says, he again asks them, it's just showing Jesus is in ultimate control, even in a situation like this. Right? Whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus answered, I told you that I am. So if you seek me, let these go their way. Do you see this is where he's watching out for the 11? Right? So he's willing to go. He's going to go with them, and he wants to protect the 11. To fulfill the word, verse 9, to fulfill the word which he had spoke of those whom you have given me, I lost not one. Okay, Jesus did protect those that God gave to him, but who did God give to him? Okay.
Those who
Well,
chose.
no. Well, yeah, I can go with that. The 11. How do you describe the 11?
Those who chose him.
Yes.
Follow him.
Yes, because it started off with 12. How did we lose one? And Jesus said, I didn't lose anybody. Because I didn't lose any of the ones that you gave me. So you gave me 11 instead of 12. What does that mean? One of his own free will decided to betray Jesus. So God has given us free will and has chosen not to override that free will. Which, by the way, I know you can make arguments. There are times when God does decide, certain occasions, that he does override. But when it comes to our relationship with God, and here, the 12's relationship with God, they had a choice, Judas had a choice. But the choosing, those that God gave to him, were those who wanted to be given to him. And so Jesus said, in essence, I am protecting those who want to be here with me. Right? Yes?
You know what's amazing is that they use Jewish, they use Judas to identify Jesus, which means that these people had no clue who Jesus even was.
Okay, it is night, and that's another argument for the fact that 600 of the Roman soldiers.
Because they were scared. They didn't know who he was.
Right. And there are Jewish leaders that are present, and part of this, let's go back up here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're part of the group. The chief priests and the Pharisees came with them, with this cohort. Yes, the Romans would be there in force, though. They sent extra troops into the area because this is Passover time. And the Jews had a history of not being an easy people to deal with. So the Romans would send extra people in at this time. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, very good. Verse 10. Simon Peter then, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. Okay, how many Roman soldiers are here? 600 Roman soldiers, and you've also got extra soldiers and extra people with the Pharisees and the chief priests, right? How many swords do they have total with the 11? They got 2. And so Peter decides, yeah, now's a good time to. I don't mean to make light of this. I really am trying to reason this through. Why? What do you think is going on here? Is John's just delivering the fact here But what other facts has he given us about Peter earlier in the night?
Impetuous.
Or,
A lot of different things that, and Jesus called him out as he's not a believer, you're not believing, you're not understanding what I've been teaching you all these years, and
Yeah,
several different occasions.
that's very true. That's very true. But
You
Peter,
will, he told him that you will denounce me or say you don't know me 3 different times.
and on that very occasion when Jesus said that to him, that you're going to deny that you know me 3 times, what did Peter just say? I'll die for you. Okay. So in a situation like this seems like, what did Bourne voice say? Today's a good day to die.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, yeah, I'm going to prove to Jesus that I'm ready to lay down my life. I think that's palatable. I think that makes sense with what we know here, because I think Peter sincerely wanted to think, I'm ready to lay down my life, right? And so whips out the sword, and it's often, the point was often made, he probably wasn't aiming for an ear, right? You knock somebody's ear off, it's probably because you were going for the death blow, right? And so we have Malchus named for us because it's going to come up a little bit later in this story. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Jesus, knowing exactly what's going on, is in essence saying, I know what lies ahead, and I'm willing to go. So don't try to stop this. The cup, Jeremiah, we were studying the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. That's a dominant place where this image is used, because he's literally told to take a cup to the nations, all the representatives of the nations, and it represented God's judgment coming upon them. So it's kind of like you can look at it 2 ways, either getting drunk and stumbling and falling and being destroyed, or being poisonous, and you're going to be killed as a result of this. It was frequently used of that judgment. Here's the judgment that's coming your way. And he said, I know that that's coming. Which, by the way, if you go back up to verse 9, where it says, this word is to fulfill what was spoken. Those you have given me, I haven't lost one. This is kind of an example of Jesus' substitution. I'm taking their place. Instead of taking them, just take me. Jesus offering himself. Jesus' sacrifice. And same thing here. Jesus is more than willing to face what he knows is coming. So John doesn't tell us. Luke, by the way, gives us the most medical graphic anatomy. He focuses more on that and uses a very specific word for the part of the ear, and talks about Jesus restoring. Malchus is here. And why would Luke perhaps do that?
As a doctor.
Okay, as a doctor, that's exactly right. So the Roman cohort, verse 12, back to verse 12. So the Roman cohort and the commander of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. I just find that so interesting, because if he didn't want to be bound, he wouldn't be bound. But they went ahead and they bound him, and they led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Okay, we've met Caiaphas before. Caiaphas is the high priest at this time. Annas is not the high priest at this time, but Annas was the high priest from the year 6 to the year 15, but he got into political trouble. And because of this political trouble, his high priest office was handed off first to his sons and then to his son-in-law. And that's Caiaphas, that's where it is now. But this is really interesting that he has to go to Annas' house before Caiaphas. Who's the high priest? Caiaphas. Why are we going over to this guy's house? Because in all likelihood, he's still running the show. Because a lot of times you don't have the title anymore, but he's like the father of the clan, the godfather of the clan. But you got to go to him first. Okay, that's probably what's taking place here. Another thing that might well be going on, some have suggested that before you go to court, you have interrogations, and maybe he's really good at that, and they're going to let him ask some questions to see if he can derive some information that maybe the rest of them can't, because they really want to get rid of Jesus. So they take him to Annas first. Annas was still highly regarded. He's the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Verse 14, now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Remember back in chapter 11, when it said that he didn't really know what he was saying when he said that. Because it had that double meaning. They're looking to get rid of this guy so they can maintain their power. But the double meaning was, no, his death is actually going to provide salvation for us. It's his death that does. It is on behalf of the people. Verse 15, Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Okay, when John writes, and he talks about one of the 12, and he doesn't tell you the name of that person, usually
John.
it's himself. That's the way John refers to himself. Either the disciple that Jesus loved or another disciple. Could be another disciple, but in all likelihood, the way John writes is probably talking about John. So Peter and John, the other disciple. Now that disciple, this other disciple, was known to the high priest. It explains why he's able to get in. And he entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, that be John in all likelihood, who was known by the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. He's just giving us a little detail here, which, by the way, sounds like first-hand account, doesn't it? Right? But he's giving us a little detail here to explain how Peter gets in here. Okay, why is this important to know how Peter gets in here? Because this is a real pivotal time for Peter. Something he never thought he'd do. This is where it's going to happen. Verse 17, then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, you're not also one of this man's disciples, are you? I like the way the New American Standard interprets this, because there are two different ways you can ask a question in the Greek language, and especially if you have a negative in there. Well, that's not true. There are two major words for not, if you want to negate something. But if you want to say, no, you're not really that person, and you expect a negative answer, you use the Greek word ne, which is one of the words for not. But if you expect a positive answer to your question, you use a different word for not, as or depending on where it's used. Anyway, she uses the word that means she expected a negative answer. That's interesting, because in just a minute, he's going to ask another question that expects a positive answer. So he writes it both ways. Anyway, the slave girl asked this question, and he said, don't tell me. You're lying, Peter. Yeah. Do you think he gets it yet? In the heat of the moment, probably not. Have we talked about this before? The more emotional you get, the less rational you are. You know, a lot of times you got to calm down your emotions before you can think rationally. They've actually done testing on this prefrontal cortex. It's hard to operate when you're in that, what do they call it, fight or flight?
The amygdala takes control.
Thank you.
It always takes control.
Thank you. I always forget that part of that. Thank you. But that emotional part, when you're under there, it's not easy to think rationally. Anyway, which really, really bothers me, because we live in such an emotional world. Verse 18, now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire. This never occurred to me before, but I had a man come to me after a Bible study once and said, how in the world can the Bible say they made a charcoal fire? Because charcoals weren't invented until the 1800s. And I thought, what? And I went and looked it up, and he's right. The kind of charcoals we're used to weren't invented until the 1800s. You don't have to translate this charcoal if that's what you mean by charcoal. It just means a coal fire. Any fire degrades into coals if it remains hot and gets smaller. Just want to make the point. It's not that kind of charcoal. Okay? They made a coal fire, a good fire. It kind of puts out a lot of heat. For it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples. Why is he questioning about the disciples? They want to get Jesus, so why bring up the disciples?
Want to do all the routes. You want to do all the routes, make sure things don't spread now.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that at all. They probably didn't realize that the disciples were going to be the ones to spread the message, but disciples usually are, so maybe that's part of it. Any other ideas why they might be questioning Jesus? Because they really want to get Jesus. Why are they questioning about the disciples?
Well, are they wondering what they might be doing to try and get Jesus out? Or, they're probably wondering why aren't they there, fighting for him, if you will.
What if they're trying to find out if any of the disciples will tell on Jesus? Be witnesses.
Okay, maybe.
Or they're
So they have
Maybe.
one.
trying to find out what he's teaching them so they can get him on heresy.
Okay, what kind of heresy would they really be concerned about? Well, I shouldn't say it that way because I don't think they're concerned about anything. They just want to get Jesus. But what kind of teaching would be a great, oh, we gotcha moment?
If they're teaching him anything against Rome.
They call that being an insurrectionist. If you are teaching any kind of teaching that goes against the government or goes against our law or goes against any of this stuff, you're a rebellion leader. Okay, so asking about his disciples, that might well be part of what they're doing, and about his teaching. The other reason I think that we need to put on the table is, have they ever gotten anywhere questioning Jesus about what Jesus teaches? No. They've never gotten anywhere with that. So focusing on the disciples makes a lot of sense in that regard too. But this insurrection idea, rebellion idea, yeah. In fact, they're going to bring up, they're going to hint at that a little bit later. Verse 20, Jesus answered him, the high priest, he's answering him and saying, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Pause for just a second. He did speak in secret. The point he's making is, I didn't have one message I put out there and another insurrectionist message back here. It's all the same message, consistent from beginning to end. More detail towards the end? Yes, no doubt. But I've been upfront and in the open with all my teaching. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. On so many levels, I love this. Jesus is going to go quiet. Remember, Isaiah talks about this, like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he's silent. He's going to go quiet during much of his trial. But there are some things he's going to answer. I find it very interesting what he chooses to say to Pilate, and John's going to chronicle that for us. But here, right up front, Jesus does say something. And what he says is, consider the facts, consider the truth. This is core to what John's saying in his whole gospel. I think it's very important to remind people, just keep bringing them back to, this is what we've always said. It's always been true. People have a tendency, especially when they get emotional or upset about things, to rewrite history. Kids are notorious for this. I've never been happy.
Yeah.
You always treated me that way. Well, you say that to yourself enough and you start believing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've never been happy in my life. Right? And let's clear up the record. I just find it very interesting the way Jesus is going to deal with them. Because notice what's going to happen next. When he said this, verse 22, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, is that the way to answer the high priest? What does this make you think of? Yeah.
Oh,
Paul. Paul got smacked in the Sanhedrin too.
call it a whitewashed wall.
Yeah. Yeah, now, saying something against the high priest, that could get you slapped. Jesus simply said, what I've said openly, and it's true, you can ask anybody, and he gets slapped for that. They broke the law when they slapped him. So Jesus' response, in verse 23, Jesus answered him, if I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. If I spoke rightly, why do you strike me? Why do you strike me? Too many times in the heat of the moment, people, when they attack, they go from one point to another point to another point. And Jesus just keeps it focused. Hey, I'm speaking the truth. And by the way, I'm not going to let you get away with that. That's inappropriate. I'm speaking the truth. If you've got something that goes against the truth, bring it up. Let's hear it. So it keeps refocusing. One of the things they tell you in debates or when you argue with somebody, which I'm glad we don't talk about this much, because you usually don't get very far when you argue. But one of the things that notoriously happens is when somebody tries to, they constantly try to back you in a corner, right? Well, when you give them an answer, then they jump to another room and try to back you in a corner. Then you give them an answer, then they jump to another room. And it's kind of like, don't play that game. If we're talking about this, let's continue to talk about this. Don't give me what ifs and other scenarios. If we arrive at the truth, we arrive at what God says, then why can't you stay in this room and make a decision about this? I don't want to read too much into this, but I really appreciate Jesus just centering on what's true. All right, let's consider the evidence. Yes?
Yeah, it also shows you that you were right about the way Ananias was
Yes.
treated, because that's who he's talking to. He just asked him why he spoke that way to the high priest.
Yes.
He's not the high priest.
Yes.
But he is.
Yes, but regarded as such.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I've watched too many shows where, you know, in these shows all the time, there's the person who has the office. You know, he may be prime minister, but here's the guy who's the CEO of the company, and he's telling the prime minister what to do. There's frequently the power behind. I think this is a classic example. Yeah, it makes no difference who's. Yeah. Okay. So Anna sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing, warming himself. We left Peter just a little while ago, warming himself by the coal fire. And this is the one that expects a negative answer. So we've got two negative answers before we get the positive answer. So he's standing there warming himself by the fire. So they said to him, you're not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I'm not. So they weren't expecting him to. It's kind of like, you know, screw up your face a little bit and say, you're not one of those guys, are you? Right? That's the first question. But verse 26, one of the servants are slaves. By the way, the word for slave and servant is the exact same word. So some translations will translate it one way, some another. But one of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off. Oh, this person might be a little more observant, right? Said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Okay, this expects a positive answer. I'm pretty sure you're that guy, right? Peter then denied it again, and immediately the rooster crowed. Okay, look at, I didn't write this down, but it's in Matthew. Turn to Matthew 26. Let's see if I've got this. No, it's not Matthew 26. It's Luke 22. Luke 22. Sorry about that. This has just always been so convicting to me, because when Peter says this after the third denial, then he hears the rooster crow, and then it says in the end of chapter 22, yeah, look at verse 60. Peter said, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Verse 61, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. That's the part that always gets. Remember, they're taking him from Annas' house to Caiaphas' house. So as they're moving him through the courtyard, Peter's just, I don't know how far away, but in the same courtyard, warming himself by the fire. And the third time, Mark tells us, and the reason Mark's so significant is Mark was Peter's scribe. So if you want it from Peter's perspective, read Mark, and Mark says the third time he cursed. Which is a big deal. He's not just saying, no, man, he's blankety blank or calling down curses or whatever. I do not know this man. Rooster crows, and Jesus, as he's been, turns, locks eyes with Peter. What does Peter do? Where is it? It's in Luke. Is it Luke or Matthew that says he went out and wept? There, yeah, it's Luke. Went outside and wept. I bet. I bet the weeping lasted quite some time. Wow. I find this so interesting because we focus on Judas a lot. I know John is really going to focus on Peter. There's two men that really, really blew it. But one of them was restored. The other one felt bad, killed himself. Immediately the rooster crowed. Back to John 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium. Do you have a different translation for Praetorium?
Governor's official residence.
Okay, it would be the Roman government residence there. And it was early. Okay, again, John gives us some firsthand details here. But I find this very interesting.
Yeah.
You know why it's so early in the morning? Why they didn't do this in the middle of the night? Because they're not allowed to pronounce judgment in the middle of the night. You have to wait till the sun comes up. Does that sound familiar? Remember, courts always convened as when it was dark and as the sun's coming up, then they pronounce judgment. Why? Because you wanted light to win over darkness. And light represented that which is good. And they're not allowed to pronounce an official pronouncement of judgment while it's still dark outside. You have to wait till the sun comes up. We're going to find some other little details. They're not allowed to go into the government house because
They're unclean for
unclean, and they want to observe the Passover feast. They don't want to. They don't want to miss the Passover. So they're still hanging on to their little laws, but they're knowing that they're lying to have somebody killed.
Yeah.
What's that? Strain the gnat out and swallow the camel.
Jesus talked about it pretty well.
Yeah. So it's early in the morning. They themselves did not enter into the Praetorium, here's where that mentions, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore, Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against the man?" Before we get into Pilate, there's this long section on Pilate. I just want to make 2 points. Over Matthew chapter 27, it makes a comment about Pilate that I think will help us. Matthew 27, verse 18, it says, "For he knew that it was out of envy or self-interest that they handed Jesus over to him." Pilate's no dummy. He knows what's going on, and he knows whatever charges they've trumped up, he knows that's not the real deal. He knows these guys don't like Jesus because Jesus is more popular than they are, right? So he knows the real motive. Having said that, John is going to focus more. Matthew gives us a lot of detail about Pilate as well, but John is going to focus more on the person Pilate, which I find very interesting because John's main goal here is to tell us what it really means to believe. And he's given us several great examples, like the man who was born blind, like several examples of people came to faith, grew in their faith. We've also got some classic examples of some people who had every opportunity in the world and blew it, turned from their faith. So we've got both positive and negative examples, and we'll pick up next week with Pilate. Questions or comments on this? This is verse 28 at 30. We're going to pick up at verse 30. I will throw out, yes.
Back from the earlier part of
today.
Mhm.
We were talking about people who were choosing not to believe and reasons why. And not, the ultimate reason why they're rejecting the faith is because they don't want to be accountable to God and His Word. That's the ultimate reason. Why there's atheism and all the false religions and all the cults and stuff, because they want to deny Christ came in the flesh, because if He came in the flesh and He overcame sin, He could be perfect, the sin can be expected of us. They don't want the accountability.
Accountability, I wouldn't say that's the ultimate reason. I'd say that's a big reason. I think for some people, like these people, it was a power struggle.
I'm talking in our modern day, modern
Sure,
times.
sure. I don't argue with that, yeah.
Why so many different groups are going against Christians? Because they don't want to be accountable. They want to live their own life and not everyone tell them what to do.
I agree with that. I think there are some sincere unbelievers too, though. I think there are some people that have so suppressed the truth. In fact, the Bible actually says they believe the lie. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, they've been deluded and actually believe the lie. They actually think that the lie is the truth. So, but I don't argue with the fact that that is a major thing.
In addition to like what you brought up was so relevant about that Jesus went to Judas even at the very end to affirm his free will. That God is sovereign, wrote the prophecies, knows what we're going to do, but still gives us the free will. So it is, which is how the Calvinism and Arminianism are total opposites, and both are totally wrong because they are demeaning God, that God cannot know what we're going to do and still allow us to have free will, because that is the divine level, but it's not ours.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and I very much do agree with Matt. With Romans chapter 8, verse 29, it says, those whom God foreknew, He predestined.
And that's where it's exactly where it's coming from, because it's, and just like God hardened Pharaoh, but Pharaoh back in Egypt with Moses, yes, God hardened, but he already was in that direction. He already had that mindset, so God just took someone that was already that way and fit the mold. God was a master of time.
Any other questions, comments? You make me think of a lot of things, and I keep us too long, so I'm going to pray. Dear God, what